Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is Dr. Arik Kershenbaum. Zoologist by profession, he is also a world-leading expert in animal and vocal communication. He's been at handshaking distance from various four-legged creatures and those with flippers underwater across the world. His most recent book, Why Animals Talk, The New Science of Animal Communication, is a revealing one. Thanks a lot, Dr. Arik, for joining in.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Tell us about the day in the life of a zoologist, especially on the field. Most of us respond to emails sitting in office cubicles, not so much for a marine biologist or a geologist or a zoologist for that matter. So how is it for you?
Well, of course, we do sit in offices an awful lot, teaching as well. There's a lot of teaching to be done. But actually, a lot of the work that we do involves analysing data that we've already collected. So yes, going out into the field, collecting data is a big part of the work, and it's a great part of the work. That often involves going to where the animals are, whether that's in the jungle or in the mountains or even underwater sometimes, and collecting the sounds that they make, observing them so that we know both what the sounds are that they make, but also what they're doing at the time, so we can get some idea of what these sounds might mean. But once you get back to the office, there's huge amounts of data now that need to be analysed, and we need to sift through it and pull out the sounds and analyse those sounds. So actually, most of the time is spent in front of the computer writing algorithms to process all that data.
In your book, you talk about in the jungle, for instance, it requires a tremendous amount of patience just to be looking through the telescope to see some action. It could be wolves at the Yellowstone National Park, where you had to spend hours standing in the snow pouring into a telescope. So a lot of patience. Is that so? What are the skills that are required to be able to just do that?
Yeah, I think patience is a big one, but patience in the wild is pretty easy. It's not like patience when you're waiting for a bus or something like that. It's actually a pretty beautiful place to be and very relaxing. And it's true that animals don't work to our timetable. They definitely don't. Oftentimes they're very active very early in the morning, so you have to get up even earlier to make sure you're there for when they come out. One never knows when the animals are going to turn up, so sometimes it's a question of sitting around and maybe not even seeing anything. But it's still, whatever happens and however long you have to wait and wherever you are, whatever the outcome is, it's just a wonderful experience just to be in nature and to move at that sort of time scale, not to have to worry about getting to the office at a particular time,
Right,
or catching the bus. It's a different flow of time.
No, it is indeed, because we live in an age where if we are bored even for 20 seconds, we reach for our smartphone, don't we? At least when, the regular folks. And that's not a luxury or a distraction that you can afford when you are on the field, whether it's a forest, a dense forest, or even underwater for that matter. You have to be, cued in is how I would see it. Would that be right?
I don't know. I think that there are long periods of time when, we'll go on your phone. Why not? But it's certainly true that you have to be alert to the kinds of signals, the kinds of cues that you might not be used to thinking about in a day-to-day life in the city, and be aware, of small movement that might signal that something's about to happen. And it's very easy to block those things out. It's very easy to be focused on your work or your commute and not to see everything that's happening around you. And one of the wonderful things about working with animals, working with wild animals, is that that's not the case. Get aware of everything that's going on so that even subtle changes can be quite significant.
Can you illustrate that with an example about these subtle changes or being alert, where you blink, you miss, or you are cued in and you see something beautiful that you haven't seen before?
So I think in many ways the best example is one that everyone can be familiar with, because when you're working with wolves and you're observing wolf behavior, wolves are quite like dogs, actually, and they're really quite like dogs in their behavior. So if you're observing a pack of wolves and you're observing what they're doing, and most of the time they're not doing very much, but they're still interacting and there's still an awful lot of body language going on. And paying attention to those kinds of, it might be a very subtle movement or a very subtle posture of one animal that signifies quite a relevant interaction between members of the pack. Now, it's easy to blank that out. It's easy just to look at the scenery and say, look, there's some wolves. That's what most people do. Oh, there are wolves, without picking up on those subtle behaviors. Now, for those of us with dogs, there's a similar risk that you might see your dog as a person or as just another thing in your house, and not pick up on all of that rich communication and all of that rich expression that they can make by really very subtle movements, subtle postures, subtle gestures. These are the things that we really deal with in our own lives.
Right, and how close have you got to a wolf in your
Well, so by and large, wolves are very, very shy animals. So mostly they stay far away from you, and they know that you're there. And if they don't want you anywhere near them, then they'll just pick up and go, and you can't keep up with them. You know, there's no way that a person can keep up with a wolf, particularly crossing the kind of terrain that they live in. So by and large, they will keep the distance they want. So usually observations are at a reasonable distance, several hundred meters. Of course, there have been plenty of cases, mostly by accident, when I've come pretty much face to face with wild animals. But that's almost always accidental. I think there was one case in Spain where went out before dawn, so it was actually completely dark. And one of the things that we do to study wolves is we howl. We do an impression of a wolf howl, and the wolves usually respond, so you know sort of where they are from where they're responding. So we were doing this. We went out before dawn, pick a spot, start howling, and the wolves responded, and it turned out that we were standing on their den. So they were actually right there. We had no idea because it was dark. But those are accidental. Those are very much accidental encounters.
Well, I remember the closest that I've come to a wolf is in watching them on Zootopia. This particular Zootopia is a cartoon Disney animated film where exactly what you say happens. And is that how wolves behave? Where to distract a few wolves who are guarding the bad man's den or some such, one of the characters starts to howl, and other guards who are wolves also start to howl by accident. It's like when you yawn, I will yawn. So do wolves yawn when they hear another wolf yawn? Do wolves howl when they hear a howl? Is that contagious?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's contagion, but it is definitely a really striking feature of their behavior. And researchers can use that to our advantage. But it is really part of the innate communication between these animals, because oftentimes the howls are used for territorial marking. So you need to make it clear when you hear another wolf howling that this is your territory. It's very important to reply straight away. So yeah, that's a real one. Disney got that right.
And the title of your book is Why Animals Talk, and I was intrigued. I wanted to ask you this very basic question, that why the title? Because it's an interesting one, because it's not how animals talk or what they talk. It is more about why, and that's a fundamental question that you're trying to answer in the book. So could you go back to what is it that you had in your mind before you put your first pitch to the publisher? What is it that you wanted to convey?
Yeah, it really is. It is an important distinction, and it's easy to forget that, or easy to think that zoologists collect butterflies or something, or name things and observe things. We really don't. Really, observation, categorization, classification is not our main goal. Our main goal is to understand why life is the way it is. What happened? What were the processes that took place to arrive at the sort of diversity that we see now? And in this case, when we think about animal communication, yes, everyone wants to know what animals are saying. I want to know what animals are saying. But the real question that we engage in, the research question, is why are they saying those things? What happened? What's that evolutionary process that led to the fact that wolves howl when they hear another wolf howling? There, as I said before, there's a very clear adaptive mechanism. There's a clear mechanism why it should be advantageous for wolves to howl when they hear other wolves howling. Those are the kinds of explanations that we really want. Why is it that a particular species has the kind of communication it has?
And you talked about wolves to begin with. So do they have a language? Why is it that do they howl? One is to mark their territory. What else have we found? And how did you go about this process of studying various dialects, syntax, or the baritone, among other things? And you talked about lots of data. So how did you piece this together, and what is it that wolves are saying?
Well, it's very difficult to piece together, actually, because a lot of the time, and particularly with animals like wolves who have these really strong clear vocalizations. And wolf howls are so loud because they have to travel a long distance. Well, if they have to travel a long distance, that kind of means that the animals aren't actually, they can't see each other at the time. And this means that we can rarely see wolves, as I said. Closest you can get is 200-300 meters at best. A lot of the times wolves howl at night. You can't see them. So we are really constrained with how we can investigate what they are saying if we don't really know what's happening to them while they're saying it. You can't see them. It might be dark. Now, of course, there are ways to deal with this. We have to think of ways all the time to probe into their minds and what's going on. By and large, we do think that wolves, most animals, say relatively little. So they don't have a huge repertoire of concepts that they want to convey. Wolves, as I said, they want to advertise their territory, say, don't come here, this is my territory. They certainly also howl between themselves, between members of a pack, to keep in touch. They want to know where everyone is, get back together if they need to come together. So, those sorts of things are the meanings wolf howls. But in general, animals don't communicate with words. This is something we need to, it takes a little bit of effort to get away from this idea that communication is about words and concrete concepts. When we say something, we mean a particular thing. Animals don't tend to do that. They really try and convey more general concepts like territoriality or like loneliness. So if a wolf is lost away from the pack, it might want to signal to the other members of the pack that they're lost, they're lonely. Those sorts of much more general concepts is really what the content of animal communication is. In most cases, most animals have very little, if any, specific information they convey. It's mostly about the state they're in. They want to mate. They want you to go away. They want you to come here. That sort of thing.
And would that explain some of the behavior of the preys, for example? Or, there are animals that signal that a predator is nearby and they help the, prey to flee, and the person who's signaling has absolutely no interest in the whole thing except telling the guys who are going to be eaten to, that there is something coming your way. Is that communication? Is that a coincidence or evolution? And I know nothing about animals except watching the odd documentary on BBC. So you'll have to educate me here.
Yeah. Mostly, in almost all cases, there's an advantage that explains behavior. So it's extremely rare for an animal to do something that actually gives it no advantage at all. It can happen for obscure reasons, but they're not really important. When you consider the case, for instance, of alarm calls, warning about a predator, well, you could warn about a predator to members of your family group. That's clearly advantageous to you because you want your family members to survive. So in that case, an alarm call is obviously beneficial. You can have alarm calls, which is very common, in a large group of animals who are less closely related, but of the same species still. Now in that case, you need other explanations for why the individual is alarm calling. If they don't seem to get a direct benefit, why did that behavior evolve at all? And usually in those cases, there is a direct benefit. It's just it wasn't clear to us at first glance. So, for instance, the animal who gives the predator alarm call is also telling the predator, I've seen you. So an ambush predator will not try and catch the animal who's seen him. Right. They'll try and catch an animal who's unsuspecting. So in that sense, there are advantages to giving alarm calls that are not just about, they seem like they're altruistic, but it's really for their own benefit. But alarm calls are really fascinating, and they're one of the easiest kinds of animal communication to study, because you can actually get animals to make alarm calls. Take a little toy tiger, or you dress up in a tiger costume and crawl through the jungle as we often do, and then you get the alarm calls. So those ones are probably the ones we know the most about.
And Dr. Kershenbaum, talk me through the time that you started out as a zoologist and today, and do you still find stuff on the field as fascinating as you did starting out, given that you've been here for a while? And can you give a couple of examples where you thought, this is what conventional wisdom held until now, but in reality this data is telling me something else altogether?
You never get bored. You never get bored. I don't think I'll ever get bored.
Yeah.
Hard to imagine how that could happen. So when I started my doctorate, I was working on hyraxes. Now, hyraxes are these small furry animals. Don't think they go quite as far east as India, but certainly in the Middle East and in East Africa, they're quite common. And I was interested in animal movement. I was particularly interested in migrations and how the animals move around the landscape. But these hyraxes make so much sound. They sing so loud, and they have these incredibly loud and repetitive songs, and I couldn't ignore the fact that here was this hyrax song, and really no one knew very much about it. No one's looked at hyrax. Even my work with wolves came out of work with dolphins. So having spent time analyzing dolphin whistles, it then became very clear to me that wolf howls are very similar to dolphin whistles. Now, they may not seem very similar to you.
Yeah.
But the way we analyze animal sounds is we use mathematical algorithms to convert the sound into an image. And so we have this sort of visual representation of the sound. And when you look at the visual representation of a dolphin whistle and the visual representation of a wolf howl, they look identical. Identical. That transformation retains that sort of similarity. And so it's like, wow, why are wolves just like dolphins? It doesn't sound sensible at all. So then you sort of switch and you go like, okay, I'm really interested in what is it about wolf howls? Where's that comparison? Where is that similarity? There's a lot of, there's so much we don't know. It's easy to switch between questions.
And you talked about dolphins. You also say that they are chatterboxes. Would that be right to say they're always communicating with each other?
Always very, very vocal. And, a lot of animals are very vocal all the time. Certainly a lot of birds, plenty of mammals as well. They'll make these contact calls. They're just chattering all the time so that other members of their group know that they're there and that everything's okay. But dolphins, they seem to communicate a lot, an awful lot. And for all of the interest in dolphin communication, there's huge interest in dolphin communication. We know very little. Another extremely difficult animal to study in the wild. There have been lots of experiments with dolphins in captivity, and that's great, and that gives us a huge amount of information. You can do controlled experiments and present them with one object and then with another and see how they relate to them. But if you ask the question, why do dolphins communicate the way they do in the wild, that's a much harder question to answer, because observing dolphins in the wild, extremely difficult, extremely difficult. You can observe them when they come above the water, but if you're going to be underwater with them, you certainly can't swim as fast as they can. It's a very difficult problem.
You've tried that, haven't you? I think you did go down, yeah.
Sure, but and there are people, not me, but other people in the field who have done like really in-depth projects working with dolphins, wild dolphins underwater. Then you're still relying on the dolphins to come to you and cooperate with you. When they swim away, they've swum away. You can't
and they're quite intelligent, aren't they? I mean, from all the literature and the documentaries, the dolphins come across as more intelligent than the average mammal. Would that be safe to say, whether it is trapping a prey by taking them to shallow waters and creating what they call they stir up the seabed and they create a little net made of mud, and then fish get confounded and then the dolphins start eating, and there are some 7 million views on one such little video out there. So I would imagine they are quite, they must be great at communication, but would it be right to say that they say many things to be able to do certain things?
So they are intelligent, that is true, and you can see their intelligence through the kinds of things we can teach them. So interacting with dolphins, they're clearly very intelligent. They do cooperate. They are very, very cooperative. And one of the reasons that their intelligence evolved was to handle living in very complex societies, very complex groups. Your question whether they communicate to coordinate these activities is a very important question. It happens to be the case that very, very, very few cases that we know of, close to zero, if not zero, of animals communicating to cooperate. So when you think of wolves hunting, they clearly hunt cooperatively. That's undeniably true. They don't communicate the details of their hunt. So they pick up on visual cues, they watch where the other animals are and position themselves accordingly. It's extremely rare at least for us to know about animals that communicate to coordinate complex activity.
Right.
Do dolphins do it? Maybe. We don't have evidence for it. There's some indication perhaps orca do it, again with their complex hunting techniques. But even chimpanzees, so chimpanzees hunt in a coordinated way. How they coordinate isn't clear at all. Quite possibly, again, like wolves, it's just sort of a natural self-organization rather than intentional communication. So we don't know the answer to that yet. It's a good question, though.
That only elevates my respect to some of these species, because when you see wolves hunt, I mean, they hunt in packs and it appears like they know exactly what they are doing to bring a prey down. I mean, of course, not 100% of the time do they succeed. But when that happens, it appears that it was a planned strategic attack and they're talking to each other, which is not the case clearly. And yet they manage to do what they do.
Yeah. And there's they manage to do what they do in the way that they do because that was the way that they evolved. And if you think about it, it's much easier, it's much more likely for cooperation to evolve that doesn't require complex coordination. Complex coordination is a very difficult thing to have. You need really very large brains, you need very specific kind of communication. There are lots of things that have to happen before animals can cooperate and coordinate in the way that we humans do, for instance. So you see many examples through evolution of animals cooperating using these self-organization principles. These are sort of the way things just fall into place. That's quite common, but intentional coordination, much, much, much rarer.
And can you tell the difference between simple communication and a complex one? Is that something that can be differentiated?
Yeah, well, what you can do is you can set like an upper bound on the complexity of communication. So if you are a frog and the only thing you say is croak, then there's a certain upper bound on the information content in your calls. You can arrange them in time in a relatively complex way, but you can see that there's not going to be a lot of information there. The trouble is that many animals sing or make incredibly complex songs, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have a lot of information in them. So the upper bound of the information content is extremely high. They could be saying a great deal, but they're probably not. And the reason that happens is because very often, birdsong being a great example, the complexity of the song is actually the message itself. So the male bird is saying, look what a complex song I have. I can sing such a complex song, I must be a really strong and healthy male. So in that sense, they need to sing a complex song to convey a very simple message, which is come and mate with me. So just because a communication is complex in its nature doesn't mean it necessarily contains a lot of information.
How do you even get to that conclusion, which is an interesting one? How do you study this data to get to that, hey, don't read too much into the complex singing? And I think you write about how it's like someone singing a complex or good rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody, which is to say that he's got a good vocal pipes, which means that he's a healthy suitor, the equivalent in the bird community or Hyrax or any place else. But the fact that you correlate that to, all right, that's great, it's only because they want a good mate.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting way of doing that, and it might sound backwards, but it makes a lot of sense evolutionarily. And that is that if you look at the social structure of an animal, you can often infer what their information needs would be. So if you see a complex communication like a song in a bird that lives on its own, you can infer that there's very little information there. Because complex communication, complex, high information content is likely to evolve in species that live in complex societies. An animal living on its own really doesn't need a great deal of communication, of information content. When you see animals that live in large complex groups, like dolphins, like chimpanzees, like humans, and you see that they have complex communication, then you don't really know what to do, because then it may be that there's information in there. There may very well be a lot of information in there, but you have to investigate that. I mean, they're the ones that are really worth delving into, because they're the species in which complex communication is likely to evolve. And then there are mathematical techniques to look at the nature of that complexity. There's complexity and there's complexity. There are different kinds of complexity, and we can hypothesize what you might expect to see if there were a lot of information.
What about parrots then? They seem to have cracked the code of human communication by at least repeating, and so much so that we tell kids, don't parrot after me, or you're merely parroting without understanding the meaning. But there is more to it, is what you write. You've got a whole chapter on parrots.
Yeah. Yeah, parrots are a puzzle. Parrots really are a puzzle. They seem to have a language ability beyond what you might expect. And by that, yes, I'm talking about beyond merely parroting, merely repeating. But parrots do seem to be able to pick up essential elements of our language, even though you wouldn't have expected it. If I told you I could teach a chimpanzee to understand me or a dolphin to understand me, you might believe me. But a bird? Well, it's a big dilemma, but it does appear to be the case that ideas of combining words to make new meanings, of understanding the intention of certain sentences, there are parrots that can do this. Now, they can do it when they're trained, and they have to be trained a lot. So this is certainly not something that happens in the wild. Parrots don't use language in the wild. But that just makes it even more confusing why this ability should be there if they don't use it in the wild, okay?
Right.
I was talking about evolutionary explanations, but why do these parrots have this ability when it's just not something that they use? And I think it points to a really important conclusion about the nature of language and the nature of the evolution of language, which is that language seems to be made up of building blocks. There are certain cognitive abilities that you need to have a language, and those abilities have arisen separately, independently, in many different species. So there are probably quite a lot of species out there that have some of the building blocks necessary for language that didn't evolve because of language. They didn't evolve because they needed those for language. They evolved for other reasons. So an example would be syntax. Many animals understand syntax. Hyraxes, my first study species, understand syntax. Now, hyraxes are not saying anything. Their song is like birdsong. There's no information there other than I'm a great male, come and mate with me. But they understand syntax because they need to be able to understand what's a complex song and what isn't a complex song. So their understanding of the way that notes are combined, the order that notes are combined is important. Evolved only to be able to distinguish, we presume, only to be able to distinguish different types of complex songs and less complex songs. Yet they have that ability. And so in other circumstances that might be leveraged to understand some parts of human language. I think that's what's happening with parrots, is that they live in complex societies. They have evolved certain cognitive abilities, not for language, just for living in a complex society. And we can then take advantage of those to teach the birds to speak English.
You write about Alex, was it Alex the parrot, who's got his own story? To tell us about that one.
So Alex the parrot was an African grey parrot, and the professor at Harvard, Irene Pepperberg, who trained Alex to understand and to communicate in human language. Now, she's a professor of psychology and knows how to design experiments to do this, because it's very difficult to design an experiment that really conclusively shows that an animal has learnt what you think it's learned. And there are plenty of videos around on the internet of people talking to gorillas and chimpanzees, and you think, oh, well, look, that the animal is understanding what they're saying. In most cases, that's not very clear at all. These are not rigorously controlled experiments. But with parrot, you can do that. And she did that and really showed that this parrot is understanding those linguistic structures, and the things that he said really answered the questions that were being asked of him. But it took 10 years of training. And this is a very, very substantial investment in preparing these experiments. And so, for all we know, there may be many examples in the animal world where, given 10 years of training or 15 years of training, assuming a sufficiently long-lived species, you could get a similar response. But we just don't know. It's not been done.
And this was to do with even solving maths problems, right? Simple, basic ones where he could spot the number of balls in a bag or the color of the ball. Those kinds of things is something that the parrot could decipher, if my memory serves me right.
Yeah. I mean, I think the ability to count has some evolutionary advantage. Now, most animals can't count, of course. Most animals know a lot from a little. Knowing a lot from a little is very important. You need to know if there are a lot of lions around or only a few lions around, or a lot of food or a little food. But actually being able to count, to use numbers to count, is pretty rare. Interestingly, found relatively often in birds. So corvids, crows and ravens and magpies seem to have a relatively good numerical ability relative to other animals. Parrots also. So there are a few cases where we know that animals can essentially count, but it's pretty rare.
And coming back to the point that you made a couple of minutes ago around singing, you also write, and I quote, that a key part of the evolution of human language is singing. So how do you mean that? In that, how important has that been even for evolution of our own language?
Yeah. I mean, so the evolution of human language is hugely controversial. And, the things that I say about evolution of human language, there will be plenty of scientists who will disagree. We don't really know how human language evolved. We're fairly confident now, that human language arose not out of a communicative need, but out of a social need. So humans first developed this very sophisticated ability to understand other individuals. You live in large groups, and there's a lot of tension and conflict and alliances that need to be made. And our early ancestors probably had really advanced cognitive skills for understanding their social environment. Now, one hypothesis would say, once you have a good social understanding, then you've really got to understand that other individuals are individuals like yourself, but different. Now, very few animals have that ability. There are a handful of species that really do understand, I'm an individual and you're a different individual. There are a few, right? Elephants, dolphins, chimpanzees, a handful. But our ancestors could do that. And then once you have that ability to understand that you're different from me, you know that you know things differently from me. I may know something you don't, and maybe I want to tell you that or to hide it from you. So the theory goes that really language was driven by that sort of first that social interaction, and then this idea of conveying information. Now, where does music come into it? Music is a interesting but unusual form of human communication, in that it's much more like animal communication. Remember, I said before, animals don't tend to convey concrete concepts. They convey much more general ideas about happiness, sadness, loneliness, and so on, which is what music does. Music doesn't convey a single unequivocal meaning. It conveys emotions. So one might argue, controversially, that singing and that more or less specific way of conveying information possibly predated our language. So it's quite likely, in that case, if that is true, that language may even have evolved before words. In fact, if we had singing and we had this social interaction ability, it's quite possible that there was a phase during our ancestry when our early ancestors communicated using a language that didn't have words, that was just more like song, and that words are almost an afterthought, an addition, a later addition. But everyone loves speculating about the evolution of human language, and there's a good chance we will never know.
There is a village in Meghalaya in India. Meghalaya is a state in northeast, where its villagers have preserved a tradition of whistling when it comes to communicating across the valley. And apparently they have a language where if they whistle in a particular way, it means something, and every kid, the mother passes on the whistle. So every name has a particular tune associated with it, and there are some 600 to 700 people in that village, and this has been passed down over centuries apparently. And one of those quirky stories from India, perhaps, but I have no idea if it has any relevance to, language and how it has passed over the years. But it's true where they communicate, and if they wish to, and they're trying to preserve this and not letting this tradition go, like any language that dies because number of people who speak it who eventually pass away. Yeah, there's a little bit of trivia that struck in my head right now.
Well, the thing is, though, that all humans have language ability. Everyone is born with that language ability. So you could take someone who was born in Greenland and bring them to this village, and they would learn the whistling language. If they were brought, it's the language, the essence of language, that unifies all humans. The particulars of what the language might be like can be very, very different. It can be whistled, it can be spoken, it can be with clicks, it can be sign language. But that ability to understand language as a concept in itself is very, very human. It's really what makes us different from other animals and makes all humans alike as well.
And when you deal with animals, and you've dedicated your book to Darwin, your dog, for 16 years, when you had a chance to be with him, and also when you look at animals, do you look at them differently from a zoologist standpoint all the time? Do you keep analyzing what is it that they're trying to say? Is it always academic, or do you look at it from a layman's perspective at all? Because it's pretty much, for you, that's an occupational hazard. How does it work?
It's not a hazard. It's not a hazard at all. And actually, it's a real privilege to have an animal in your house, in your home, and to be exposed to a different way of communicating. It's not academic, but it's very subtly enriching, that if you open your eyes, as I was saying before, if you don't blinker yourself to think that this is another human, or this dog is communicating to me like I would communicate to you, but actually open your eyes and see the animals as the animals that they are, with their ways of communicating that they have, and really sort of become aware and become receptive to all those signals, then that's a much deeper relationship with animals that you share your home with than if you just see them as even if you see them as humans, you're missing a huge amount.
Well, Dr. Kershenbaum, thank you so much for your time on this podcast, and congratulations yet again on Why Animals Talk. Thanks, really. This was fun.
Thank you very much. I had a great time.
Thank you.